During my last video, we had a lot of comments about my shirt being a little bit too tight, and admittedly it was a slim size as opposed to just the normal size I wear, so it caught me a little bit off guard as I'm not as slim as I used to be. And so as you can see, we've taken your concerns very seriously, as we have a shirt that fits me even better. So let's get started with our look at what happened in July 2021 in review. So last month I did 2 interviews for Fossil Shark Week, and both of these interviews with Dr. Bobby Bosenecker and Dr. Dana Arrett, they both brought up the Pisco Formation because it preserves some incredible fossils, including of sharks, like Carcharodon hubbleyi, which was actually described by Dr. Dana Arrett as he mentions in the video. A new paper looked at that formation, the Pisco Formation, and looked at the taphonomy of it specifically. And taphonomy just means essentially what happens to the animals after they die. And let's just try and figure out why there's so many great fossils coming from this formation. What they propose is that a lot of these fossils come from essentially death assemblages, meaning a lot of animals died all at once. And this is somewhat brought up by the very similar alignment of certain whale fossils that are found within the formation, which means essentially the tidal currents that would have been shifting these bodies around before they settled to the bottom would have been the same on each of these bodies. Now, these bodies aren't necessarily all lined up right next to one another. They can still be very far away, but they do still have the overall same direction of travel and essentially movement with the currents. And so that means there was something that was probably taking up a large area that was causing these die-offs. And they proposed the most likely thing to have done this is essentially red tides. Red tides form because certain types of plankton, like diatoms, are actually toxic and produce toxins. And so when there's a giant bloom of these plankton, they can actually produce so much toxin that it kills off a lot of life. And this has actually happened even in the modern day, where you can see some of these off the coast of Florida recently. But on top of the bodies essentially seeming like they died around the same time, there's also evidence in the rock itself with some of the formation being diatom-bearing mudstones, meaning the hard shell of some of these diatoms actually is preserved in the rock. Unfortunately though, there's not any of the very well-known toxic versions of diatoms that are found in this formation just yet. And some diatoms that are very toxic actually don't have this hard shell, so they may not actually preserve. This means there may still be another cause of death for all of these animals. However, that's going to really take a lot more looking at this formation to try and figure that out. And that's just because we don't have distinctive evidence that these more toxic diatoms were actually present in Peru during this time period. But once these animals did die, it does seem as though they floated at the surface for a while. And this is based on the fact that many of these fossils are found belly side up, meaning essentially the belly would have started to decay, releasing a lot of gases internally. This then would have caused that part of the animal to float before eventually rupturing and then sinking to the bottom. And so this is something that's another good indicator that they may have potentially had this kind of toxic environment where not any other animals could survive either. And that's because while there are some cases of scavenging on some of the bones in the Pisco Formation, most of them are actually pretty solid. And this includes the whales. When we look at modern day whales that have died and have sunk to the bottom of the ocean, certain animals, including especially tube worms, will grow on the skull of the whale and essentially burrow into it, causing the entire skull to splinter. And this is something we do see in many places in the fossil record, where there's the same kind of splintering of fossil whale skulls. However, in the Pisco Formation, that doesn't seem to be the case. Essentially, these tube worms don't seem present. And so there is a chance that these kind of toxic algal blooms were the cause of all of the incredible preservation we have in the Pisco Formation. Looking into another formation that has really good preservation, we're going to be looking at the Solnhofen limestone, which is a Lagerstätten, which just means that it has really fancy preservation, and specifically at Archaeopteryx. A few months ago, there was a paper that suggested that Archaeopteryx molted sequentially, and this is similar to the patterns that we see in modern day birds. This just means that the feathers that were molting out of the animal and allowing new growth of new feathers to show up essentially happened in an order, as opposed to just randomly occurring throughout the wing. Another group of researchers looked at this paper and didn't find the same thing. Instead, they suggest that there's actually not enough evidence for this because A, some of the feathers that may have been essentially new growth may not have actually been new growth, according to these new authors. Additionally, these new authors also stated that even if it was new growth, there's no way to show very distinctively that this is sequential molting. It could have still just shown up randomly. And especially since the authors on the first paper essentially used this sequential molting to suggest that yes, Archaeopteryx could fly, because modern birds that fly have sequential molting, you can still get things like sequential molting or that appear like sequential molting in animals that absolutely do not fly, like ostriches. So there still needs to be a lot more work done to try and understand how the modern day molting cycle of feathers actually evolved. There's also been a growing body of research on the Jehol biota, which is from a Chinese Lagerstätten, from which many of the best known feathered dinosaurs are known, with animals like Syntomiprosopus, Caudipteryx, and even Pterosaurs. But this paper didn't look at just the animals that live there, it looked at the environment they would have been living in. And this was done using isotopes that form carbonates, which just means it forms a CO3 molecule, which then bonds to something else. The isotopes that show up in the carbonates, though, can help to indicate what the temperatures would have been and essentially what the environment was. And what they found is this was probably a very high altitude environment, potentially as high as 3,000 meters. So that's about 9,000 feet. So this is pretty high up. I'm actually in one of the most highly elevated cities within the United States, and we're still about 2,000 feet below that. So this is a very high altitude area where all these animals were living. And that also could potentially indicate that since so many of these animals had feathers, that they may have just had feathers for warmth. Even animals like Ute tyrannus from the Euxine Formation was massive at about 30 feet long or around 10 meters. And it still had feathers, potentially just to stay warm during the winter especially, because in high altitudes it would have gotten very cold in this formation. And so on the subject of how feathers became linked to flight, there was a paper earlier this year that suggested many of the earliest birds were herbivorous, and this would eventually lead to flight, because these herbivorous ground birds that were stuck to the ground when they were feeding would have needed to fly to escape predators. And that's not entirely unreasonable as long as we can show that the earliest birds were actually very likely to be herbivorous. With that in mind, a new team of researchers looked at the chances of herbivory in the early birds, and what they found is essentially nothing distinctive. A lot of this kind of studies that we would need to really identify the diets of these early birds in the fossil record just haven't been done. This includes things like finite element analysis, which is essentially just measuring the spaces where muscles would attach on the skull and essentially measuring how strong the beaks of these birds would have actually been, and could they crush seeds like we expect of many modern herbivorous birds. There were also other tests that they suggested, such as just body size, as larger animals are more likely to be carnivorous, at least in the birds specifically, or at least flying birds. There were also specific tests that were tried, such as body mass, because in general, sparrows are going to be smaller and more herbivorous, and things like falcons and hawks are going to be larger and more carnivorous. So body mass may have something to do with the diets of these animals. And again, there's a whole host of different things that these authors do propose. In fact, you can see the entire list here, and essentially what they would expect for if the animal is herbivorous or carnivorous. And so it's really great that they have all of these planned out tests, but unfortunately, none of the research on this has actually been done yet. A lot of times in scientific literature, you'll be summarizing what other people have already written, and that's essentially what these authors tried to do. But unfortunately, there wasn't anything written. So they're just laying out the groundwork for future work to be done so we can try and understand what the diets were of the first birds. And on the subject of flight, we actually have an early gliding reptile. And I want to be entirely clear if this is gliding. It's not flying, it doesn't have wings that it can flap, but it was definitely moving through the air better than most animals. And it's actually from the early Permian, so even before the dinosaurs first showed up on the scene. Coelurosauravus elivensis was an early Permian weigeltisaurid, and the weigeltisaurids probably all glided, at least most of them did. In fact, there was a paper earlier this year looking at Weigeltisaurus to try and help prove and essentially redescribe its bones so we can have a better understanding of what kind of a gliding membrane it would have had. And it actually probably would have stuck out a lot like modern day Draco lizards, which do glide from tree to tree. But Coelurosauravus is actually really useful for understanding this group because it has one of the most complete skulls of any weigeltisaurid. And this includes being able to show us things like they probably didn't have any vomer bone at all, and also that there was a large gap between the pterygoid bones. And this generally just means that there was a lot of space in the jaws so that they could power very large and strong muscles. And this means they were probably eating relatively hard things. And so this could be things like seeds or like pine cones, because some of the earliest conifers were evolving during this time. However, it may also just mean they were eating a lot of insects, because hard exoskeletons do take powerful jaws to try and get through. But Coelurosauravus wasn't just like all of the other weigeltisaurids, because it had larger front teeth, which may have been related to its specific diet versus the other weigeltisaurids, but it also had a crest, and this was probably used for display or potentially defense. It's not entirely clear just yet what it was used for, but one of those two options is the most likely case. So while it was still doing some things that were very different, it still is very similar in a lot of ways to the other weigeltisaurids. And so hopefully we can start getting an idea of how the first group to really kind of take to the skies, although not quite flying, actually started to evolve. And as for another group of odd reptiles, we're going to look at the Placodonts, which are actually from the Triassic, so a bit after the weigeltisaurids. And they were also mostly aquatic, and seemingly very convergent with turtles. I mean, they also had very large shells, and depending on what phylogenetic analysis is used, they actually do pair fairly closely with turtles within the Eosauropterygians, which includes things like the Plesiosaurs as well. Unfortunately though, as I kind of alluded to with that, depending on which analysis you use, the Placodonts are pretty understudied, and this paper doesn't do anything to really change their taxonomy and which groups they're related to, but it does try to understand how at least one probably fed. They scanned the skull of Henotus chalops, which actually still had teeth, and modern turtles and even fossil turtles don't really have teeth, so this is a really great example of why they aren't turtles. But those teeth were also very interesting because they were concave rather than being convex. When we look at other animals that eat hard-bodied prey, things like globidens, which is also a reptile in the water during the Mesozoic, it had very rounded teeth for crushing ammonite shells. Now, Henotus probably did not go after ammonites because it was just too small to really be trying to hunt after ammonites. And also, its very convex teeth mean it was probably eating very, very small prey itself. In fact, there's been some gastropods, which are snails, found alongside the skull fossils of Henotus. And these actually could fit fairly nicely inside of these convex teeth plates and potentially be crushed and eaten by Henotus. But despite the teeth being relatively small and having this concave surface, they were still replaced in the same way as some other reptilians, specifically using vertical replacement, which just means that the tooth grows straight up from under the old tooth. And so this is different than we see in some other animals, which essentially have the other tooth start growing behind it and then push the old tooth out of the socket or out of the joint, as some of these reptiles actually don't have tooth sockets. Hopefully though, this is the start of a whole new line of research on the Placodonts, so we can try and better understand what was happening in different reptile groups during the Triassic, when many modern groups were diversifying and becoming eventually what they would lead into today. But the Placodonts aren't the only weird Triassic reptiles, and some of them are actually closer related to things we do know in the modern day, such as the archisauriforms. Now, the archisauriforms include, in the modern day, animals like the crocodilians and the birds, and that also means it includes the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, but that's not what this paper is on. It's instead about a new species that was found from a very famous quarry that contains many fossils of the animal Placarius. This quarry was found in the 1930s in Arizona, and there have been dozens of fossils of Placarius pulled out of it. It's been very, very well sampled, and so finding an entirely new animal was completely unexpected. And it also wasn't closely related to Placarius. Placarius was a synapsid, so relatively close to mammals, while this thing, like I mentioned earlier, is an archisauriform and potentially even an early crocodilian or crocodilian relative. Named Syntomiprosopus sucherorum, it was pretty different from all of the other related animals that lived during the same time. And this is largely because it had a very short face. It also had differently linked teeth, which is something we do eventually see in the crocodiliforms, although much, much later during the Cretaceous with animals like Simosuchus. But animals like Simosuchus with these differently linked teeth are largely believed to have been herbivorous or at least omnivorous. So there's a pretty good chance that Syntomiprosopus may have also been herbivorous or omnivorous. And it also helps to go to show that even in very well-documented sites like this Placarius quarry, there's still new things that can show up all the time, and even new things that aren't anything like their closest living relatives. Other times though, we find things that are very similar to their closest living relatives, and this includes some of the sharks. And these shark fossils are from about 12 million years ago during the Miocene, and they're from South Korea and help to represent a very deep ocean environment in the formation they were found in. There's actually two different genera of sharks found in this formation, and both of them are very deep water living, at least as far as their closest living relatives today, and they are the same genus as those closest living relatives. The first genus is Mitkusurina, which is more commonly today known as the goblin shark. And these animals live in very deep water and actually probably patrol the very bottom depths at the seafloor, and using that very long nose-like projection to help sense electrochemical signals from their prey that is on the sand or underneath the sand, and then eat it that way. The other teeth are from Dilatius, which today is the kitefin shark, which, as you can see by their massive eyes, are also a very deep water shark. So it's very likely that this formation in South Korea is very representative of the deep water oceans of around 12 million years ago. And just through tectonic forces, this particular formation was uplifted so we can have these fossils that are easy and available to access. And on that subject of essentially uplift occurring, we're going to pivot into geophysics, because the Earth rotates, but not always in the same place. Essentially, while we might often think of the North Pole as being what we know of it today, it can migrate and it can move around, and that changes the rotational axis of the Earth. Now, it's been generally thought that the particular axis we have today has been pretty stable for about the last 100 million years, but a new study helps to show that about 80 million years ago, there was a pretty significant change, and this would have been a few degrees at least off of its modern day rotational axis. There's actually a video that somebody else already did that talks about this paper in much greater detail from more of a planetary science kind of perspective, and so that will be linked down below. But basically what probably happened is the balance of the Earth changed, and this could have happened internally. When we think about the surface of the Earth, there's mountains and valleys, and it's very likely that the inside of the Earth also has these mountains and valleys. The core and the mantle probably aren't perfectly spherical like they're normally shown on a lot of Earth diagrams. Instead, there's probably mountains and valleys in those too, and depending on how those change, it could potentially change the weight distribution of the Earth. And because it's changing the center of gravity potentially, it may actually change how the Earth rotates. And this may be what happened based on this paper. It's really hard to know exactly what's going on the interior of the Earth, but it does help to show that for at least that 100 million years that we thought it was pretty stable, there was still a lot of change going on. As for what this means evolutionarily speaking, we really need to do more research, because it essentially just means that certain formations may have actually been at different latitudes than we previously thought, which means the overall environment may have changed, although a lot of the connections we do see between these environments are probably still correct. When we look at the fossil record, there's a lot of fossils that are older than 80 million years ago, and so would have gone through many of these events, so we know it's not super significant. And one of these lineages is actually the sponges, which some recent genetic studies have shown are probably the first animals to diverge from all of the rest of them. And now new fossils help to narrow down the date at which that happened. And this is because the genetic studies suggest it happened at least before the Cryogenian, which happened around 650 million years ago and is known as Snowball Earth. But now, new fossils from about 800 million years ago, which are generally just kind of squiggly lines, may actually show the first fossils of sponges. Now, there's still going to be a lot of debate as to whether these little squiggles are actually sponges. But if they are, it does help to show that by at least probably 1 billion years ago, both the animals, which does include sponges, and their closest living relatives, the fungi, had probably split off from one another. And this is because there would have been a lot of time for more of these different adaptations, including multicellularity, to have evolved in both groups, thus giving us the sponges, but then also fungi. These potential fossils also seem to be most similar to keratose sponges, which some genetic studies have shown to be the earliest diverging sponges from the rest of the sponges. And so this means that after just this one find, it does seem like the genetic record and the fossil record are becoming much more in sync. And next we're going to look at another group of animals that's pretty well known in the fossil record, although it only starts during the Cambrian and extends till about the end Triassic or the end Permian, and then other animals evolved this same feature, and these are the straight-shelled orthocones. Orthocones were nautiloids, so more closely related to things like the nautilus than they were to things like the ammonites, although some ammonites did in the Cretaceous evolve this same kind of straight shell, and there's been some question as to why do they have such a straight shell. A new study has been able to start providing some evidence for why this feature evolved multiple times. And what they suggest is that it was for movement, and this isn't horizontal movement. It's not going side to side because the cone is more pointy and helps it move faster. Instead, it was more likely to do with buoyancy, as the orthocones and the long shells probably help them to maintain balance in the water more effectively. And then if they needed to sink, they could fill that with water and reduce the amount of volume that they were taking up with gases and sink quickly. Conversely, they could also dump water and expand those gases more quickly and escape upwards. So this means that it was probably a very good adaptation for just moving vertically rather than side to side like they've often been depicted. And so it's very likely that if they were being hunted, they could escape up or down, and when they themselves were hunting, they probably drop down to prey near the ocean floor. And that's because it wouldn't have anywhere to escape, and it could very suddenly just drop onto it, take it up in its arms, and feed. And sticking in the water, we're actually going to be looking at a group of completely marine crocodilians, and those are the Metriorhynchids. Now, there's actually been a few groups of completely marine crocodilians that did evolve in the fossil record, and the Metriorhynchids are just one of them. However, this new study didn't look at how they were related. Instead, it looked at the skin of the Metriorhynchids, because some of these are from Lagerstätten, and so there is very good preservation on many of these animals. What they found is, like some of the other reptiles that have also been preserved in Lagerstätten, they probably had very smooth skin, and so this includes things like the ichthyosaurs or the plesiosaurs. However, it is still slightly different from sea turtles, which were doing something completely different, and it's not entirely understood why, although it may have something to do with the fact that they had their large shell. But as for the Metriorhynchids and why it's interesting that they had smooth skin is because when we look at modern crocodilian skin, it's anything but smooth. In fact, there's a lot of osteoderms throughout the skin, and osteoderms are essentially pieces of bone that grow inside of the skin. And in crocodilians, these help to provide some protection, but also form a kind of heat sink, where essentially the animal can store heat in these osteoderms and then it can keep itself warm when it goes into the water. So the Metriorhynchids were doing something entirely different, and it probably evolved very, very quickly, because even in some of the oldest Metriorhynchids, we don't see any of these osteoderms showing up in the fossil record, because the osteoderms are bone. We should find them if they were there. There still needs to be more research on this skin though, because there are some small markings which might actually indicate that there was another animal living on the Metriorhynchid. And so this could be like some of the whales that have different populations of other animals living on them. And the same thing could have been happening in the Metriorhynchids. And so there's still, again, a lot that needs to be done, because as far as we know in the fossil record, there isn't any other evidence that other animals were living on large sea life at this time. So something weird is still going on with the Metriorhynchids, and we need to study it more. In changing gears into dinosaurs, there was a news release by the Fukui Prefectural Dinosaur Museum. And again, this is just a news release. It doesn't functionally describe the actual specimen. It just says, hey, we found this neat thing. And what they mention is that they found the largest known ornithopod dinosaur coming from Japan. Now, unfortunately, this fossil is really partial. It's essentially just a scapula or shoulder blade, but it was a hadrosauroid, meaning it was either a hadrosaur or a non-hadrosaur hadrosauroid. And hopefully someone's going to come through and define that group more distinctly, because there have been a lot more finds of non-hadrosaur hadrosauroids, and they're still not really given a proper name as a clade. So hopefully we can do something with that. And if that does happen, hopefully they can find a couple really distinctive characteristics that separate the two groups on the scapula. That way we can try and identify what this animal is based on what's honestly very, very sparse remains. Like I said, it's just a single bone, a shoulder blade. Now, on the subject of the non-hadrosaur hadrosauroids, there was one of these already described earlier this year coming from Spain and based only on a dentary, so essentially just the lower jaw. And they did name it its own thing, Phylax, based on some of the different width ratios that are found in that jaw that do show it was different from other animals. And by golly, the Spanish have done it again, and there's a new hadrosaur named from just a dentary also coming from Spain. I really do just want to point out how odd it is that both of these animals are known only from lower jaw bones, and both of them are unique enough to both get their own genus name, with the new genus being called Proteosaurus sospinati. Like Phylax, it was also an early hadrosauroid, and it actually groups really well with one distinctive group, the Styracosterans, and this includes the African Ouranosaurus and the Chinese Bolong. And this kind of placement taxonomically was repeated multiple times. Actually, in every test they ran, it did group with these other two taxa. And I want to point out how strange it is that it does show up with these animals so consistently. And that's because there's a lot of different theories that go into how we should understand how closely related different animals are. And depending on which one of these theories you'll find, in most papers, the animal will group slightly differently, although it still ends up in the same general area. And then from there, it just comes down to statistics and personal preference for those theories for which group the authors do say it belongs to. This time though, they were all consistent, which is, again, very, very unusual. So kudos to these authors for finding the specific details from only this dentary bone that can help us understand better what Proteosaurus actually was. And now for another group that we don't actually know what they are, we're going to be looking at the Megaraptorans. And the reason I say we don't know what they are is because we can place them as a theropod, but after that it kind of goes up in the air. Because they might be closer related to the allosaurs, or they might be closer related to the Coelurosauravus. And the Coelurosauravus is a really big group. They include everything from the Tyrannosaurs and Compsognathus as early members of those groups to the birds today. So very diverse. And unfortunately, a lot of the Megaraptoran fossils are super incomplete. But at least one is less incomplete, which is super convenient, because that way we can actually start to understand how some of the different features of these animals would have actually looked. And so this paper is just a redescription of that specimen named Arostion. And what these authors found is that there are some very specific features in the vertebra that do align more closely with the early Coelurosauravus than they do with the allosaurs. And so this is another piece of evidence that does help to suggest that the Megaraptorans are probably Coelurosauravus, rather than being further related in the allosaurs. And there's even been some debate as to whether or not the Megaraptorans, if they were Coelurosauravus, are actually Tyrannosauroids, meaning not Tyrannosaurus line Tyrannosaurs, but just some other line and lineage within that group. And that's really going to be hard to tell until we have more fossils, but that would be really, really exciting and a pretty neat thing to find out. And now we're moving to something that's kind of a hodgepodge, at least as far as its name is concerned, of different animals, because you first have the javelina. And the javelina is a pig-like animal, not a true pig, but closely related, that lives in parts of the southwestern United States, down all the way into parts of South America. And then you also have Dactylus, and Dactylus just means finger. So if you're thinking this fossil is a javelina that's only known from one of the finger bones or one of the toe bones, you'd be entirely wrong. And that's because Dactylus is also a common suffix for some of the pterosaurs. And so Javalinadactylus just means the pterosaur that comes from the Javelina Formation. And the Javelina Formation is in Texas. And Javalinadactylus is not like any other pterosaurs known from this time period in North America. So the Javelina Formation was laid down during the very latest part of the Cretaceous. And most of the other pterosaurs we have during this time period in North America are the Astarchids, so super, super huge animals like Quetzalcoatlus. And while Javalinadactylus was an Astarchoid, it took a different evolutionary path, becoming a thalassodromine. Now the thalassodromines are kind of poorly understood. Some researchers have considered them to potentially be fruit eaters, although they could have also just eaten whatever else they wanted to. It was also a lot smaller than animals like Quetzalcoatlus, as this animal probably didn't stand much taller than the average person, and that's even if it did have a relatively large crest, like many of the thalassodromines actually did. But the more important part than just what it was, because it is pretty partial and the researchers could be wrong about it being a thalassodromine, it could actually be an Astarchid like Quetzalcoatlus. But if it is a thalassodromine, it would be the first one coming from North America. And what this probably means is that thalassodromines were still spreading around the world and diversifying up until the latest Cretaceous. And so if there wasn't just a sudden massive rock that hit the planet at thousands of miles an hour, they probably would have done pretty well for themselves for at least a few million years after this. And finally, because this is just kind of one of those things I harp on, is ethics. And there was a paper that specifically talked about paleontology and ethics. And what they try to do is essentially set out what specific guidelines people should be trying to follow. And that's because many of the terms for paleontology and ethics haven't been properly defined. And if people are going to be trying to write proper research papers about how we should be approaching paleontology from an ethical standpoint, we need to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And so because of that, these authors form a new word, paleontoethics, which is a little bit wordy, but when you look at the actual definition, it does make sense because they define it as a branch of geoethics that consists of research and reflection upon the values that underpin a correct behavior and practice while collecting, handling, researching, and exhibiting fossils. Paleontoethics promotes the analysis of ethical problems and dilemmas that arise in different geological, economical, social, and cultural contexts, which affect the management, conservation, and popularization of fossils. Now, I do think this term could actually be a little bit more broad, and that's because there are some ethics concerns in paleoanthropology as well that could be brought under this umbrella. However, it is a great starting point to try and start building these conversations, so we can try and make paleontology more ethical and more understanding of many of the places we're taking these fossils from. Because there is kind of a long history of essentially white people walking into different countries, taking the fossils and shipping them away. And that causes a lot of these places that have had their fossils taken from them to essentially lose part of their national heritage and their historical heritage from even just a broader geological standpoint. And so hopefully we can try and address many of these issues so that all people can have better access and a better understanding of our natural world. And now, moving into things that I actually already did entirely separate videos on, our first paper is going to be looking at Heterodontosaurus ribs, and that's because parts of these ribs were found that weren't previously known, and they were found using some very interesting methods, and you can check out the full video for that. But essentially, they were able to help show how this animal would have breathed, and it's a lot different than what we actually expected from dinosaurs. And a large part of this is because birds, which are dinosaurs, breathe differently than most other land vertebrates, in that they have air sacs that inflate, but the lungs stay relatively stationary during the breathing process. Whereas these ribs in Heterodontosaurus would have had a large amount of flexibility in them, meaning that essentially, like humans, the entire chest cavity would have expanded when they took deep breaths in. And that's a lot different than what we do find in birds and probably a lot of other dinosaurs. Now, Heterodontosaurus was an ornithischian, meaning it was a group of the herbivorous dinosaurs. And so this probably means that a lot of the herbivorous dinosaurs started out with this kind of breathing mechanism. The paper does suggest, though, that some of the later ornithischians had a different breathing mechanism, and I do go into that in more detail in the proper video. There was also a video we did on whether or not hatchling pterosaurs could actually fly pretty early on or not. And this would be entirely different than what we see in modern flying day vertebrates. And so you can think of things like birds, which have hatchlings that stay in the nest for a long time, or things like bats, where the young stay attached to the mothers for quite a long time. What these researchers did, rather than looking at growth series like some other papers have, they looked at the musculature, or at least potential for musculature, on actual hatchling pterosaurs. And what they found is that they probably would have had a pretty good basis for the musculature you would expect in flying animals. In fact, when graphed, they actually plot high above the line of best fit for body size versus humeral strength, so the humerus, the arm bone, and its strength relative to the overall mass of the animal, meaning that they're actually probably pretty well equipped to fly, and were probably taking off even when they were very, very small. And this would have been very, very consistent even among some of the largest pterosaur groups, such as the Astarchids, which probably did very similar things even as hatchlings. And the final video we did was actually looking at two different papers which each discussed different night terrors. And I use that term very loosely because neither of these animals are actually that frightening. The first is bats and the other is nightjars. And what these two papers show is that both of them were evolving around the same time during the early Eocene, so just about 10 million years after the impact that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. What this means is that A, this niche was super wide open after that impact, and so multiple groups were evolving into it. However, it also helps to show that the bats probably started in Central Asia rather than starting in the Green River Formation, where the earliest bat fossils before this new fossil have been found. Additionally, the nightjar fossil actually comes from England, which means they probably had a much more European distribution early on, as other early nightjar fossils come from places like France and Germany. However, other fossils from the Messel pit in Germany where that nightjar was found also include things like other early bats. And so this means with this new fossil that the bats were probably more successful and actually spread out over a larger area early on into their evolution, at least when compared to the nightjars. However, both of them have pretty much caught up with one another at this point because the nightjars and their relatives are pretty much equally as widespread as the bats are today. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. I do want to mention again, we are trying to get a podcast started that would have myself, who knows about paleontology as a student, my wife, who knows about paleontology through me, and a friend of ours who knows nothing about paleontology. It's honestly kind of funny coming from someone who grew up with a lot of it. I also want to give a big shout out to our patrons. That's Sean Crummet, Sexy Toad, Luke, Kurt Commands, Ertabbed, Steve Black, Madeline Lockyer, and Sean. That's two Seans, different people. Don't forget, if you join the Patreon, you can actually vote for the What the Hell Are These videos, which is the one that I mentioned at the beginning of this video where my shirt was too tight. And that can also help to pay for a shirt that might actually fit. So, you know, two birds, one stone. With that in mind, everybody, be safe, take care, keep wearing a mask, I know, and don't go extinct.